Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to talk about something that could have a big impact on your ability to deal with your own land.
Right.
We're talking about restrictions that are sometimes hidden, and they can actually limit what you're allowed to do with a property, even if you're the rightful owner.
Yeah, people assume owning a property means they have complete control over it,
Right.
but that's not always the case. There are some legal mechanisms out there. We call them cautions, caveats, and restrictions,
Yeah.
and they can really impact a property owner's rights.
And the thing is, we're not just talking theory here. We're going to look at some real-life judicial precedents today to see how these encumbrances actually play out in practice.
That's right.
So just imagine you've bought your dream house,
Yeah.
and then you find out you can't sell it or you can't even build an extension on it
Oh,
because of some obscure legal hold.
that can be a real shock,
Yeah.
especially if you weren't aware of these potential pitfalls when you were buying the property. So let's unpack these terms. What exactly are cautions, caveats, and restrictions? And how can they affect you as a property owner?
Yeah, what are we dealing with here? What are these things?
Well, think of a caution like a temporary flag
Okay.
raised on your property title.
All right.
It's basically a notice that someone puts in place who claims to have an interest in your land,
Mm-hmm.
and it basically prevents anyone from doing anything with the property until that interest is sorted out.
So it's like a pause button until things are cleared up.
Exactly.
Got it.
Now, a caveat is a bit more formal.
Okay.
It's a notice that's actually registered against your title,
Mm-hmm.
and it also claims an interest in the property.
Okay.
But unlike a caution, a caveat actually stops you from doing anything with your property without the consent of the person who lodged it.
So it's a stronger claim than a caution?
Yes, it carries more weight.
Okay.
And it can be a much bigger obstacle for the property owner to deal with. Now, restrictions, those are a completely different thing.
Yep.
There are sets of rules that govern how you can use your land,
Mm.
and they're attached to the property's title,
Okay.
and they're binding on any future owners as well. So these rules might limit things like what type of buildings you can construct, the height of those structures, or even the specific activities you're allowed to do on the property.
So even though you own the land, you might not be free to do whatever you want with it.
Exactly.
Interesting.
These restrictions can be there for a lot of reasons, like preserving historical sites or protecting the environment, or even just stipulations set by previous owners to control how the land's developed in the future. And sometimes these restrictions, even though they were meant to do some good, can end up being misused,
Right.
Or they might just stay in place long after whatever reason they were put there for is gone.
Yeah, and that's when things can get really interesting. We have one case, for example, where a property had a caution slapped on it because of a boundary dispute.
Oh,
And get this, the dispute had been going on for 13 years with no end in sight. The owners were stuck. They wanted to use their land freely, but this legal hold was stopping them.
I see.
What happened?
Well, in that case, the court ended up siding with the property owners. The court made it clear that while cautions are there for a reason to protect potential interests, they shouldn't be used to just indefinitely restrict someone's property rights without a good reason.
Right, so the takeaway is these things are important,
Yeah.
but they can be misused. It's really important for property owners to understand their rights
Yeah, absolutely.
and how to challenge encumbrances that aren't justified or are outdated.
Very important. Awareness is key. In another case, a property owner was in a situation where they couldn't do anything with their land because of a restriction imposed by the Criminal Investigations Department.
Oh, wow.
And the restriction was still in place even after their investigation was finished. It left the owner in this bureaucratic limbo.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
It was. The court basically said in this case that while restrictions can be put in place for investigations,
Mhm.
they have to have a clear end date and be justified.
Right.
It shouldn't be an open-ended thing, especially when the reason for it doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
So the court ruled for the property owner in that case as well,
Right.
and emphasized how important it is to be fair and reasonable when these restrictions are applied.
Right. So these cases show how tricky cautions can be, and they show why we need to be really careful about how they're used.
Yes.
But what about caveats? Can they be misused in a way that unfairly restricts a property owner's rights?
Definitely. There's a precedent where a buyer, after failing to buy several properties, registered caveats against them.
Really?
So this basically blocked the seller from dealing with any other potential
So
buyers.
they were using the caveats as like a bargaining chip, even though they didn't hold up their end of the deal.
Exactly. The court, though, wasn't fooled. They ruled that the buyer had no right to keep those caveats in place because they had broken the terms of the original agreement. This case shows why it's so important to have clear and comprehensive sale agreements to stop people from exploiting caveats like that.
It seems like these legal tools are supposed to protect people,
Yeah.
but they can be manipulated
Yeah.
and create problems for property owners. What can we do to prevent these situations from happening?
Transparency and due diligence are crucial.
Right.
When you're buying or selling property, you have to do a thorough title search. You need to see if there are any cautions, caveats, or restrictions already there.
Oh.
And you really need to understand what they are and how they could affect you
Right.
before you make any decisions.
This deep dive is already revealing a lot about property law.
Yeah.
And it's showing how important it is to be in the know.
Yeah.
Let's move on to restrictions.
Okay.
As we mentioned before, they can sometimes feel like a whole set of rules controlling what you can do with your property.
So with restrictions, unlike cautions and caveats that are usually temporary,
Right.
restrictions are often more permanent.
They're tied to a property's title,
Mm-hmm.
and they really dictate like the do's and don'ts of how you can use the land.
Okay.
So they can shape how it's developed
Right.
and even affect its value over time.
So it's not just about buying or selling, it's about what you can actually do with the land once you own it.
Exactly. Restrictions can get really specific. They might tell you what kinds of buildings you can put up, what materials you can use, even things like what color you can paint your house,
Really?
or what kind of business you can run there.
It's interesting to think about how these restrictions came about in the first place. Like, were they always a part of property law, or did they kind of develop over time?
Well, the idea of restricting how land is used has been around for a long time.
Okay.
It's often connected to what the community wants
Right.
or what the people who first developed the land had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Think about those historic districts you see sometimes where
Right.
there might be rules to keep all the buildings looking a certain way,
Right.
to preserve the look of the neighborhood.
Exactly. It's all about keeping a specific style or historical feel.
But how do those intentions from the past hold up today? What happens when things change? Or if a property owner wants to do something that goes against a restriction that's been around for ages.
That's where it can get tricky.
Yeah.
There are cases where owners have challenged those old restrictions, saying they're outdated or they don't make sense anymore. There was this one case where an owner wanted to get rid of a restriction that limited how high buildings could be on their property.
Okay.
That restriction had been in place for years, and it was actually stopping the owner from developing the property in a way that matched the current zoning rules and what the community needed.
So the restriction was holding the property back,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
In that case, the court understood that while restrictions are useful for keeping things orderly and protecting the community,
Right.
they shouldn't be set in stone.
Yeah.
There needs to be some flexibility, some room to adapt as things change.
Okay.
So they ruled in favor of the property owner, saying that the restriction was no longer relevant and was getting in the way of reasonable development.
That's a good example of how the legal system can be flexible
Right.
and make sure restrictions don't become unreasonable burdens on property owners.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are also cases where restrictions are upheld because they still serve a valid purpose.
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about restrictions that are meant to protect sensitive environmental areas. They might limit development or certain activities to protect natural habitats or water sources.
So it's a balancing act then, protecting individual property rights, but also taking care of the community or the environment.
It is. And then there's the question of who gets to decide about these restrictions in the first place. Sometimes it might be a government agency.
Right.
Other times it could be a developer or a homeowners association.
So the source of these restrictions can be different depending on the situation.
Exactly. And it's really important for property owners to know who has the power to enforce or change these restrictions.
Okay.
If you ever come across a restriction that you think is unfair or outdated, knowing who to talk to and what your legal options are is really crucial.
So this all points to the need for things to be clear and for information about these restrictions to be readily available.
Right.
How can someone buying a property or even someone who already owns property make sure they know about any restrictions on their land?
Title searches are crucial, especially when you're buying property. A thorough search will show you any registered restrictions,
Mm.
and that lets potential buyers consider those limitations before they commit to anything.
Okay.
For people who already own property, they can get a copy of their property title from the land registry.
Got it.
That'll confirm any restrictions that are in place.
So knowing what you're dealing with is really important.
Absolutely. Being informed about your property rights and any limitations that might be there is essential for making good decisions and avoiding potential disputes in the future.
Okay, so we've talked about how restrictions can come from wanting to preserve historical things,
Right.
or from environmental concerns, or even agreements within a community. Are there any other common situations where these restrictions pop up?
Yeah, restrictions are often used when it comes to easements,
Okay.
which basically gives someone the right to use a part of your property for a specific reason, even though you're the owner.
Okay.
So, for example, a utility company might have an easement to run power lines across your property.
So even though I own the land, I might have to let them do that.
Exactly. These easements are usually recorded on the property title,
Right.
and they apply to future owners, too.
Wow.
It's important to know about any easements that might affect your property
Okay.
because they can impact how you use the land,
Right.
and they can even affect its market value.
It's fascinating how these legal things that most people probably don't even know about
Yeah.
can have such a big impact on how we deal with property.
They really do. It just goes to show that owning property,
Yeah.
while it gives you certain rights, also comes with responsibilities and limitations
Right.
shaped by legal frameworks and what's happened in the past.
This deep dive is really opening my eyes to how complex property ownership can be.
It is.
I think it's something a lot of people aren't aware of. We've looked at different kinds of encumbrances,
Yes.
where they come from,
Mm-hmm.
how they can impact property owners.
Right.
But what about challenging these encumbrances?
Right.
What can property owners do if they feel like they're being unfairly restricted?
Challenging a property encumbrance. Well, it can be tricky, but it's doable. The first thing is to understand the basis of it, like where it came from. Figure out who put it in place. Was it a government agency? A previous owner? A homeowners association, maybe? Knowing who you're dealing with is super important for deciding what to do.
It's about knowing the who, the what, and the why of that restriction before you can even start to think about fighting it.
Exactly. Once you've got a good grasp of what's going on, you can start looking at your options. One way might be to try negotiating.
Okay.
Like if the restriction came from a private agreement, like with a neighbor or a previous owner,
Uh-huh.
you might be able to work something out, maybe modify the restriction or even get it completely removed.
So just talking it out and being willing to compromise can sometimes solve the problem.
It can, especially if the restriction doesn't really make sense anymore, if it's outdated or no longer serves its original purpose.
Right.
But if that doesn't work, or if the restriction is from a government entity or a law, then you might have to go the legal route.
What does that involve? What can property owners actually do in those situations?
In some cases, you might be able to apply to the land registry to get a caution or caveat removed, if you think it was put there unfairly or wrongly. If it's a restriction, you might have grounds to go to court. You could ask for a declaration saying the restriction is no longer valid,
Okay.
or that it should be changed to fit the current situation.
So there are legal ways for property owners to fight back if they feel like their rights are being stepped on.
Yes, there are. But it's important to understand that these legal battles can take time.
Yeah.
And they can be expensive. Gathering evidence, making legal arguments, dealing with court procedures.
Right.
It can be a lot to handle.
That's where having a good lawyer who specializes in property law can really make a difference, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
A property lawyer can look at your case, tell you what your best options are, and represent you properly.
So we've covered the different types of encumbrances, their history, the legal side of things,
Yes.
and even how to potentially challenge them. What are some key things our listeners should keep in mind as they navigate property ownership?
I'd say the most important thing is awareness.
Okay.
Just knowing that owning property doesn't mean you have absolute control. There might be limits on what you can do with your land.
Right.
Secondly, due diligence is key. When you're buying a property, get that title search done properly.
Uh-huh.
Identify any encumbrances. And get legal advice to make sure you understand what they mean.
Okay.
And lastly, remember that you have rights. If you think an encumbrance is unfair,
Yeah.
or it's restricting how you can use your property unfairly, look into what you can do, get a lawyer,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've shed some light on this complex area of property law that I think a lot of people just don't know about.
Yeah.
We've explored the different kinds of encumbrances, where they come from, the history and the legal stuff,
Yeah.
and we've even talked about how to challenge restrictions that might be outdated or unfair. The main message here is that knowledge is power when it comes to property ownership. Understand your rights, do your homework, and get expert advice when you need it. That's how you navigate the tricky world of property law and make sure your property rights are protected.